Welcome to this Grattan Institute webinar. I'm Amy Haywood, Deputy Program Director of Grattan's Education Program. I come to you today from Wurundjeri lands, and I acknowledge and celebrate the First Nations people on whose traditional lands we all meet and work, and whose cultures are among the oldest in human history. This conversation today is about implementing a structured literacy approach, and it follows on from a recent report that Grattan released called the Reading Guarantee: How to Give Every Child the Best Chance of Success. To talk about what this looks like in practice on the ground, I'm really excited to have with me two very special guests, Jacquie Burrows and Halie McColl from Churchill Primary School. Churchill is a small regional Victorian school serving a low socioeconomic community. Jacquie is the principal and Halie is a learning specialist and classroom teacher, and they've been working over the last 6 years to switch their approach to teaching reading to a structured literacy approach. Thank you so much for both being here. The structure of this conversation, we've got about an hour. I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting. You won't hear from me for too long. Just talking about what the Grattan report found and what our recommendations were for policymakers. Then I'm going to hand over to Jacquie and Halie, who are going to talk you through what you're really interested in hearing. How did they change their approach in their school? We'll have some time at the end for Q&A. Please do use the chat function. We've got some people that have submitted some questions earlier, but we love getting them live, and we'll put them to Jacquie and Halie. I'll take a little look at them as they go through. But before we get onto that, I'll just talk to you a little bit about this report that you may have seen, the Reading Guarantee. One of the headline findings that we found in our research was that Australia does have a reading problem. So we're failing to teach reading well, and students, unfortunately, are the ones that are paying the price. About 1 in 3 Australian students are not proficient in reading across the country. That finding is based on the new NAPLAN proficiency benchmark, which sets a bar for the expected outcomes a student should have achieved. That is a higher bar than the old national minimum standard, which we used to have, which was accepted as, woefully too low, but it's not particularly stringent. So, for example, a Year 9 who just scrapes through that proficiency benchmark is working at about 2 years below, or the average Year 7 student. But we do know that those students who are lacking in proficiency, it's going to be much harder for them to keep up and stay keeping up at school, and those learning gaps that they have can widen over time. Speaking of gaps, we do know that, unfortunately, it's disadvantaged students who are affected most. It's important to remember that 20 to 25% of advantaged students are also going to struggle with reading, but on the whole, that situation is worse for disadvantaged students. Now, of course, measuring disadvantage is complex. There's different ways to do it, but we do know from NAPLAN data that half of students in regional and remote areas are not proficient in reading. About 60 to 70% of First Nations students are not proficient. And when we look, as this chart does, at student outcomes by family education outcomes, so if your parents didn't finish school versus if they went to university, the gap gets a lot wider over time. So it starts at about 1 year in reading performance in grade 3, and then it goes all the way up to a 5-year gap by the time students are in Year 9. And that's the opposite of what we want our schools to do. We want to close that equity gap and not let them get wider over time. One of the things that we know contributes to that is something called the Matthew effect. You might know that biblical phrase, the rich get richer while the poor get poorer. Well, in terms of reading, you can see that when students that really struggle early, they're more likely to find things harder, find reading less enjoyable, and without intervention, they'll read fewer words, they'll pick up fewer books, and that has a compounding effect over time. In contrast, students that learn effectively experience early success. They enjoy the reading that they do. They read more words. They're more likely to pick up more books and then know more words from reading those books, and that becomes self-reinforcing too. So what we want are schools that disrupt that pathway for poor readers, and we want them to move up into that higher pathway. We also know that it's good for Australia because the costs of that reading failure are huge. We estimate conservatively that for those students that are hit hardest by poor reading and that they do drop out of school, the cost for those current students in school today is about $40 billion over their lifetime. So we know it's a big problem. Fortunately, we do actually know a bit about what can help students to become proficient readers. And we do know that one of the contributing factors has been this decades of disagreement about how to teach reading in Australia. And it's really muddied the waters, made it confusing for teachers and led to a huge amount of variation in classroom practice across the country. But the research evidence is clear about that a structured literacy approach is best, and that means you've got a strong focus in the early years on systematic instruction in phonemic awareness and phonics, those decoding skills, alongside that exposure to rich literature through read aloud, so everyone gets to read the book and exposure to those words, and alongside that explicit teaching to build vocabulary, fluency, and background knowledge. So a real key explicit approach to teaching all the reading sub-skills. That doesn't mean that we just leave and kind of end up picking up reading. We know that the early years are really key, and once those students have mastered decoding new words, ideally with lots of practice with things like decodable readers, then they can switch broadly from learning to read and decode to reading to learn. And ideally they do this by the end of grade 2. That's a really important thing. But they still do need a lot of explicit teaching all the way through primary school, all the way through secondary, to make sure that they can comprehend what they read, which is the ultimate goal of reading. And that's hard work. It's not just the job of one teacher, it's the job of many teachers and school leaders over time, and it particularly matters for disadvantaged children. To do this well, schools need to take a systematic whole school approach. And on top of this, some students will need additional support to help them catch up if they fall behind. So children tend to need less catch-up support if we're able to give them support earlier. So close monitoring is something that's key too. So that's what we know can work. We know that obviously needs a lot of work on the ground from schools, and we set out a 6-step reading guarantee strategy in our report to highlight, here's what we think governments can do to support schools in their work. This is a comprehensive suite of reforms. I'll only talk about it briefly. It's long-term. We give it a 10-year horizon, but it's a package where we would say you shouldn't pick and choose reforms that actually need to work all together. So I'll talk about those 6 steps. The first one, we recommend targets. So given that the evidence shows that almost all students can learn to read when provided with high quality teaching and support, we recommend committing to a long-term target of 90% of students reaching that NAPLAN proficiency benchmark. And over the next 10 years, a 15% percentage point improvement, which is, we think, achievable. For a school, that means just 6 more students in year 3 become proficient in the next 10 years. That needs to be supported in our step 2 by guidelines. Currently, guidance given to teachers can be wrong, it can be vague, it can be inconsistent. So developing guidelines that are built off the evidence base, where they are built on the expertise of known experts in this area, but also combined with the practical tools that teachers need. Assessment schedules, validated lists of reading programs. These are the kinds of things that will help teachers, mean they don't have to build these things from scratch. Step 3 is about getting those curriculum materials and assessments into the hands of teachers through quality assurance and subsidising schools to purchase them. In terms of helping then schools in step 4 with catch-up supports for the students that need them, a really key part of that is that regular screening to make sure that you can target that support at what students need. So we're recommending governments require schools to twice yearly assess in Foundation to Year 2 using robust assessments, and so that they can catch up those students, and then also another assessment on entry into secondary school to make sure students aren't falling through the cracks. A big part of our recommendations is around teacher expertise, which is step 5. So it's absolutely crucial. We have a number of recommendations, some of which are a core part of professional development for primary school teachers being in reading instruction, so about 25% of their PD hours, that every school has a literacy instructional specialist who is a classroom teacher, but also coaches and works with other teachers on the ground, that governments invest in high quality micro-credentials and set up demonstration schools to share best practice. Our final step is around encouraging monitoring of practice on the ground. And one of those recommendations is the implementation nationwide of the Year 1 national 40-item phonics screening check. It's an efficient test. It can provide a health check on the system in Year 1. Unfortunately, at the moment, in some states, the first national measure we have is Year 3 reading, which is too late to wait to check on students' reading skills. So that is a whirlwind overview of our report and what's in it. Of course, our focus is on policy recommendations for governments, but we know that It's schools where that work is happening on the ground to implement a structured literacy approach, drawing on these supports from governments. And we do have exceptionally strong practice happening on schools right now. And who better to talk about that than those people that have actually done it, who is Jacquie and Halie. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that they can share a little bit, and they're going to walk us through their approach and how they've changed it over time.
Thank you, Amy. And I'd just like to thank the Grattan Institute for giving us the opportunity to talk tonight. And thanks for those who have joined us, and we really hope that you get something valuable out of our presentation. I do also just want to say thank you to our staff at Churchill Primary School. It does take a committed team to make the changes that we've made. And we are lucky to work alongside some amazing leaders, education support staff and teachers who have been instrumental in making this change to improve the literacy outcomes of our students, which we know will improve their life opportunities. So we're just really going to talk through tonight, our journey, what we've done to achieve and embed structured literacy at our school. And also, we really just want to give practical examples. So, as Amy said before, this is 6 years of work. It's a lot of work, and we've got about half an hour to do it. So it is just a really brief snapshot. But there is, lots of other things that have contributed, I guess. So first of all, I just wanted to share our data with you. So Haley's got controls of the slides. So we did start to make our change in teaching literacy in about between 2017 and 2018. So the dark blue that you can see is the amount of students that we had who were not at anywhere near the expected level for reading. And you can see over time that we decreased those bottom two bands, but then we increased the top two bands. So in this is our, oops, do you want to go back? Sorry, Halie. Yeah, so our grade 5 reading. So you can see that in 2023, we had 84% of our students in the strong and exceeding area for NAPLAN. And if we compare that to the state had 77 and like schools had 61. So I guess that really demonstrates that, not only are we performing, above like schools, but we're also, performing against the state as well. Oh, my light's just gone off. Sorry, my light just went off. Yeah, so that's our grade 5 data. Our grade 3 data, we do have our 2024 preliminary data in this year. So again, we had 79% of our students this year. There's some more things that need to happen, but, that are in the strong and exceeding. So if you go right back to, 2018, you can see that, the increase has been huge. So I guess that's why we're often asked to talk and explain what we've done. And, where we really start to see the changes in our data is when we started making the shift towards structured literacy. All right. So the catalyst for change, it was really simple, I guess. It was that we just didn't have our kids achieving in reading. So we did start in reading. And you can see in 2018 in grade 3, we had 31% of our kids in the bottom two bands, so really 1 in 3. And then and our grade 5s were the same. Our school also had really high levels of dysregulated behaviour. We had, especially in class, so off-task behaviour, kids who just didn't want to be in the classroom, and the teachers were really, I guess, battling through every day with lots of disengaged children. We had a lot of variance between classrooms, so we were using a balanced literacy whole language approach, but teachers were doing really, really different things in each classroom. So we didn't have a consistent approach. And, there were different spelling. There was, teachers were spending different amounts of time on different aspects of reading. There was lots of independent reading happening in classrooms. There was sort of the workshop model in some and not in others. So there really wasn't a consistent approach. And we started to look at, just had a bit of a Google really around, how we could change reading. We started to use a little bit of phonics, and that kind of led, I guess, the leadership team to looking, and we almost stumbled across Bentley West Primary School, who has really, I think in Victoria, really pioneered the work and the change to structured literacy. So I do want to acknowledge the knowledge that we got from Sarah Asome, and also the support from Steve Capp in how we lead this work in schools. Bentley West and Churchill are really different contexts, but a great example of how, this approach works in different contexts. And then the other thing was we were influenced by the work of Pam Snow, and really inspired by her, and also Lorraine Hammond as well, who did some professional learning with us right at the start. So those individuals, there's a lot more people, but they were absolutely instrumental in our change. So basically what we did was we made changes to what we teach, we made changes to how we teach, and then also how we assess the learning. So they're the three main areas that we're going to talk about tonight. So we've got a really quick timeline of the change journey. I think the key to what we did was we invested a lot of time in building our teacher knowledge about how to teach reading. What we found was that what we'd learned at university was very different to what we were discovering about how to teach reading and how kids learn to read and what's most effective. So we did start with a synthetic phonics program. So for us, we chose Orton Gilliam, and all our teachers did training in that. And we first started really just with a focus on decoding, and we also started intervention really quickly, because we just, with the results, our data showing what it was showing, we knew that we had to get in and intervene really early, and that intervention is more effective in the early years. So that was our start. So it was all about building teacher knowledge and understanding. Then we developed a really low variance curriculum for literacy. So our leadership team, or our middle leaders, did a lot of the curriculum development, so our teachers could really focus on instruction. We did professional learning about cognitive load theory, and then, but mainly in 2020, it was on decoding. So what we were teaching. 2020 was when we started to look at how we were teaching. So we did some professional learning around explicit direct instruction. That was the model that we decided on. And we started looking at our data for literacy in PLCs. And then that sort of continued. 2021, we looked at another element of reading, which was fluency. And then, so, we'd sort of build our knowledge up piece by piece. So we'd build our knowledge, we'd implement it in the classrooms, and then we'd monitor it. 2021, we focused more to comprehension and the writer's revolution, which teachers started to implement. And the focus of 2022 and 2023 has really been around how we're using core knowledge curriculum, so teaching background knowledge to students, because we know that background knowledge really helps with comprehension. But having said that, we did, I'll talk more about it in its slide coming up, but yeah, we did a lot of professional learning, and we had a really narrow focus as well. It was just reading. That's what we focused on when we started to make the changes. Excuse me. So I'm just going to get a drink of water. Do you want to go, Halie, for a sec?
I guess so. The first part of our the presentation, we'll talk about what we teach. So, like Jacquie said earlier, there's a significant resource spent on building teacher knowledge and in the 6 components of reading. And that was piece by piece. So money spent on professional learning, money spent on resourcing, things at school like decodables, just teacher resources, time. That's a big resource as well in a school. So that was a big part of being able to make a change. It's that resourcing for it. Now I can't click through my slides. All the teachers attended professional development and training. So we didn't do a train the trainer model. All the teachers went and heard it from the expert themselves, and then were able to come back and implement at school with everyone having the same, have the same knowledge and being able to implement it in the classroom with fidelity. We also developed a low variance curriculum for the big six. So there's a couple of examples coming up of some of those documents. But that was the leadership team did, and middle leaders did a lot of that work, and it was and that was sort of so the teachers did the professional learning, and then they didn't have to really spend the time thinking about what am I going to teach here, what am I going to teach there. It was sort of already laid out for them in a scope and sequence, so they could pick it up, say I'm teaching this, and then concentrate on actually teaching those instructional practices. So that helped reduce workload for our teachers. It also helped to reduce their cognitive load as well. So they weren't trying to do lots of things all at once. They were concentrating on putting that knowledge into practice, and those instructional practices. Yeah. Jacquie, do you want to go now? You're on mute.
Righto. There's lots of models about teaching reading, which are quite similar. So we did draw on Scarborough's reading rope and the simple view of reading, but this was the one that kind of resonated the most with us. So beginning reading instruction, you can see that the foundation is oral language, and that's our secure base. And then we need to teach phonological awareness, phonics fluency, and then comprehension is, I guess, the ultimate goal of reading, but also the vocabulary contributes a lot as well. So for us, when we started making the changes, we made sure that, at all of these aspects were part of our literacy block. So this is an example of our low variance curriculum for English. So this is our morphology scope and sequence. So we mapped this out for the teachers so they knew what to teach and when to teach it. And then we went through and we did that for all other aspects of the house that we just had a look at.
These are some examples of what we teach. So I guess this is an example of a phonics lesson for the initial code. So this is a prep lesson. So you can see all the different parts of handwriting, words to read, which is, decoding learn words, auditory drill. So lots of, that's just some of the parts, and they're not organized in the way that they are in a lesson either. They're just some examples of some slides. The next one is an example of a higher grade. So this is an example of phonics lesson in grade 3. So they're learning the extended code there. So there's lots of decoding. There's learning the new sound. There's dictation. There's fluency. There's also comprehension within the fluency. So there's lots of parts. It's not just phonics here. We're trying to build in, syllabication, all the parts of reading of the big 6 even in a phonics lesson. This is a few examples of some morphology lessons that we teach as well. So we break words apart. We look at the meanings of the parts of the words and put them together and put them into sentences. We build words as well using suffix and prefix and root words that we've explicitly taught. And yeah, there's just some examples of what that looks like across school. The next one is this is an example of a knowledge rich lesson or unit, really. We've got the unit plan there. You can probably see that back there. We have units planned like this. It's broken up into a whole unit and then into lessons. So you can see, if we're thinking about, the big six of reading, we have picture talks, which is going to build their oral language. We have vocab that's explicitly taught. There's phonological awareness when we're looking at parts of words and breaking them up, and rhyming when we're looking at nursery rhymes. I probably should have cited these are from the Core Knowledge Foundation, so that's where we get these resources from. So the next one is a 5-6 knowledge unit. So I guess you can see how the level of the text gets a little bit more sophisticated from the foundation kids, but you can see that the vocabulary specific, but there's also oral discussion. So we're building that oral language comprehension as well as decoding in other parts, and also looking at how we can link reading and writing as well. So showing understanding through from their reading through writing as well.
So the next part I'm going to talk about is how we teach. So that's the instructional model that we use when we're teaching. So we did develop a whole school instructional model, and the one that we chose was Explicit Direct Instruction, which is by Ybarra and Hollingsworth. We did professional learning with Joe Ybarra, which is fantastic, and we've even revisited that in recent years, because it's always different once you've implemented something than to go back and really refine your practice. We started to implement daily reviews. So that was the work that we did with Lorraine Hammond. So basically it was making sure that we're revisiting content regularly, so that the kids, so it goes to long-term memory. We did also developed agreed instructional routines, which we'll talk about a little more, but that's all documented. So that might be, what do we do with a picture storybook when we're doing a vocab lesson, or how do we introduce new vocabulary? What's an EDI lesson look like, and how do we structure that? So an explicit direct instruction. And we also really develop tight classroom routines. So we didn't have the kids learning in small groups anymore. We had a much more structured classroom. So we put all our desks in rows, and we just had lots of routines, which we'll talk about a little more. But one of the big changes that we made was that we would teach at grade level. So things were pitched at grade level, and then we differentiate to support the students. And we did a lot of whole class teaching rather than the little groups. So when we used to teach, we'd have the teacher with a guided reading group or something, and then the kids doing independent tasks. Whereas what we discovered was that it was much more effective to have the whole class engaged at one time, and then scaffolded and differentiated to support that. So they were some really big changes that we made.
So this is explicit direct instruction, so the Ybarra and Hollingsworth model. So you can see a couple of posters there. So we can see the lesson design. That is the structure that we use when we're teaching new content. So the lessons are designed with this structure and also taught this way. And then with our engagement norms, they're instructional strategies, I guess, that require kids to be engaged in the learning. So, and they're always doing something. So it might be tracking. So tracking as the teacher's reading, or they might be reading with the teacher. So they're reading or making a gesture using whiteboards. So we try to do those every 2 minutes. So the kids are doing something with the content that they're learning. And then our lesson delivery, that's a strategy, TAPL. So that's just a structure of how we're going to teach and ask a checking for understanding question, and the process that you go through for that. Always teaching first, not asking a question first, and then, maybe getting some misconceptions spread across the room. We don't want that. Next one here is some examples of daily reviews. It's based on spaced interleaved and retrieval practice. So like Jacquie said before, daily review is the purpose of them is to move learning or new content into long-term memory, and by doing that, bringing it back to working memory, and just that process of retrieving, doing something with it in working memory, and then hopefully making that pathway back to long-term memory to be able to draw on again. We also, when we do daily reviews, we tell the kids why we're doing this, so they have, you know, a bit of understanding of you know, what they're doing, why they're doing it, and also that also helps with some engagement as well.
Okay, so our instructional routine. So we developed a key document, so a literacy instructional routine booklet. Some schools are calling them playbooks now, and that really just documents our routines. We also developed common planning templates, and the way we did it was leadership would develop it, or middle leaders, and then we would provide it to staff for feedback, and then make changes. So, you know, we did do it, you know, the staff were involved in developing these documents, but we did a lot of the heavy lifting as well, because we wanted them to be focusing their attention on their instructional practice. So we know that the routines help with reducing cognitive load for the students and the teachers, increases time on task. I think if you observe our classrooms, you'll see that the pace is really quick. There's not a lot of wasted time at all. So routines really help with that. And it provides predictability for our kids. And we know that predictability and routine is really important for kids to feel safe and at school, and particularly for kids who may have experienced trauma. And they also helped with achieving low variance across the school. So some examples of our classroom routines. There's just a quote there from Anita Archer: if you expect it, pre-correct it. So if you know your kids are going to, I guess, you know, squabble over who's in the front of a line, we have a line order. It's a really simple thing, but that reduces those things and maximises instruction time. So we have a daily schedule in every classroom. We have exit and entrance routines with the line order. We have seating plans. So our plans also help the teachers support kids who might need additional support. So those kids might be at the front. So the teacher, you know, with the most skill can access those students who need the most support really quickly. How our learning materials are organised as well helps us maximise time on task. And we also use the Berry Street education model. So we have regular brain breaks. We start the day, you know, in morning circle, and then have some soft landings for transitions once the kids come in for playtime. So the other thing that this does is, you know, the routines are the same for the students from year to year to year. So we don't have to spend a whole week of, you know, term 2 explaining routines. It's just, you know, the same from year to year. Obviously, there's, you know, differences as the kids get older, but basically, the kids just know what's expected. So I'll just let you jump in for a minute. But Halie in a sec, but Halie is our instructional coach. We use an instructional coaching model, which means our best practitioner is who is coaching our teachers, and we've just felt like that was just made the most sense to us when we started it. So coaching is really how we monitor the implementation of our instruction and the quality of the teaching that's happening in the classrooms. Sorry, Halie, I'll let you go now.
Man, that was perfect. Nice one. So I guess the instructional coaching model that we have here, you know, is focused on instructional strategies that have the biggest impact on improving teacher practice. And, you know, from some work with Lorraine Hammond and a few other people, we've been able to develop a model that you know, is successful and has impact at the school. So I work with the teachers to build not only their practice, but also their knowledge and their understanding of instructional, of our instructional model, but also practices that will help to, whoops, there's my light, to improve student outcomes. So like Jacquie said, we use a model where the coach is the expert, and it's done across all classrooms. At the start of the year, when we have new teachers, that's sort of part of our induction process as well. I spend quite a lot of time in their classrooms doing lots of modelling, bit of team teaching, on the spot feedback, that sort of thing. Instructional coaching at Churchill involves formal and informal observations, and also modelling of lessons, co-teaching, side-by-side teaching, and feedback in the moment. It also involves lesson planning and instructional practice, like routine rehearsal. So we can practice some of the things that they're working on with their goals away from the classroom. So we can do that together. Feedback, which is focused on what's working well and in their practice, and then setting goals with the teacher. So that is one thing that has changed over our time. It is that, to start with, we were coming in and giving goals to the teachers, but now we work them together. Also, support depending on those with experience of teachers as well. And then we have tracking check-ins between observations, and we also do learning walks with leadership. So they are we all track what's happening across the school. That's a good way to monitor any patterns that we're seeing, where some professional learning might need to happen, if there's common patterns across the school.
Okay, so how we assess learning, this is a question that we're often asked. So we use short cycle responsive teaching, so that minute-to-minute checking for understanding in the classrooms. We do mid-cycle assessments, so our daily review assessments and pre and post assessments. And then, of course, we've got our long cycle summative assessments that we do once or twice a year. Flick to the next slide, Halie. All right, so these are the assessments that we use. I won't go through all of them, but you can see we do use a lot of assessments, but they're sort of they are for different purposes. We just find that these assessments are helping us really pick up kids who might be at risk of not progressing, and then this assists us with getting them into intervention really, really quickly. We do provide time for our teachers to do some of the big assessments. So we use the York Assessment of Reading Comprehension twice a year, and our teachers do get time one day to do that. So, that's something we really value. So we want to give the teachers the time to do it. And we do provide a lot of professional learning for the teachers to ensure that these assessments are, valid and reliable. So that is the list of assessments that we use. It does seem a lot, but some of these assessments are really, really short. Sorry, Halie, you're right. Okay, so the response to intervention model, we have really high quality instruction at Tier 1, which is our EDI and teaching of the Big Six. Our Tier 2 intervention is small group intervention with a trained facilitator, and we use Mini-Lit and Macclish, but then there also might be other, phonological awareness interventions or small scoop, depending on what our data says. And then, of course, we do have our intensive and individualised support. So that will look like we do Autumn Gillian one-on-one for some of our students who has significant learning difficulties or dyslexia. We have the speech therapy assistance program, and then we also have students on individual education plans. We do invest a lot in building the knowledge and skills of our ES staff as well, but we always make sure that any intervention is overseen by a teacher at the school. All right, so we're probably a bit pressed for time. So we've got some just overviews of what this is one overview of grade 3-4. So what timetable looks like. There's lots of planning documents that underline this. So you can see in literacy they do their morning learning, a phonics and morphology lesson, a literacy review, fluency pairs, handwriting, and then they'll do an EDI lesson. So we do have a 2-hour and 15-minute literacy block in the morning. We also do spell mastery across the school as well. And we'll just finally finish with just some other data sets. So yes, our academic data is strong, but so is our this is our students' attitudes to school survey. So this is about their engagement at school. So you can see that's really strong. So we're above state for that. So things like effective teaching time, effective classroom behaviour. And then if we look at our staff survey, we often get asked, what did the staff say and what do they think when you're sort of really directive about how they teach? But our staff are really happy. And, in terms of collective efficacy, our staff now have the skills and the knowledge to move the students along, which I guess makes them feel really empowered. So our staff opinion survey is really strong as well. And I guess the other thing is our behaviour in classrooms. We don't even really need to track that anymore. Our kids are really engaged. We're not seeing the off-task behaviour and, those dysregulated students compared to what we were back in 2000. And finally, there we go. That's a new slide. I haven't seen that one. But yeah, if you want to learn more about our story, Nathaniel Swain, who's been an amazing support and is doing so much good in making sure the science of reading is being known to lots of people with Think Forward. He's written a book which is coming out soon, and then there's the Reading Guarantee and the Science of Reading in Practice webinar with Think Forward. We're also happy if anyone's got any questions to email Churchill Primary School, you'll find the email address. I was going to put mine up, but just find it on the web. So thank you everyone for listening. And I think we've got 14 minutes left for questions, Amy, so we didn't do too bad.
You did a great job. I thought it was a tough ask to be able to summarize so much work in such a short amount of time, but I think you did a great job. I'm going to jump straight into questions because there are a few that some people pre-submitted and there are some that people have also put up. If you have a burning question, feel free to put it in the chat. I think at the moment we can see them, but other people who are attending can't see them. So one question that somebody pre-submitted, and we've had a few asked a few times, is around what books you actually use with your students. So what are the kind of books that students are actually reading? And then particularly what's the role of libraries in how you approach reading at your school?
I'll talk to that one, Jack. We've got some slides here. So we do have a lot of decodables. So we were able to invest into resourcing decodable books. So we do have them. We also, so I'll just go through a couple of slides. So I guess if you're thinking about decodables, this is just an example of a decodable and what a decodable involves. So I know there's a lot of talk about decodables being boring and no story, and this page is not a great example, but there's some really interesting decodable text that students like to read. So if you look at this one, there's 8 phonemes, there's a full stop and a capital letter, there's no irregular words. They cannot guess the words by looking at the pictures. That's what we don't want them to do. We want them to be pulling the words off the page. So they can't look at the picture and be able to guess those words. If you look at this one, this is a predictable text. These are the ones that we used to use before we made changes. So this is a text that a prep would take home in their first year of school. This is a predictable text. So there's 20 phonemes, there's 1 new digraph, and there's 22 irregular words. And then there's some other sounds in there like the C that says and the in look. So there's lots of sounds in there that in prep they don't learn. So that's where you're getting look at the picture. guess the word. Oh, animations. So I guess this is our library. Kids do borrow books from the library. So we're not only decodables, but students do take, in the early years, juniors do take decodable text home, but they also take library books home as well. So decodable texts are based on the code that they've learnt and been explicitly taught in the classroom. And then those texts will have those sounds in them to practice and reinforce at home. Library books are borrowed and chosen by the student and taken home. And they're read with their parents. So they might look through the book, their parents might read them, but that's for enjoyment and that oral language building and those sorts of things. So the aim of sending the decodable home is to build fluency and practice previously taught sounds. In the older grades, if the students need code practice, they'll take home decodable text and semi-decodable text. You can buy decodable books to suit older kids. They're not like the one you saw before. We don't send them home for, if there's a kid in grade 4 or 5 that still needs a decodable or a semi-decodable, they're a little bit more complex and the stories a little bit more, at their level. And then if students are efficient decoders, then they're allowed to choose a book to take home and read, and it's usually something that they want to read, something that interests them.
Halie,
does that answer that question?
That absolutely answers that question. And
Can I
follow up? Jacquie, do you want to go?
Sorry, can I just add to that, Amy? We do also do lots of literature in the classroom. So we have novel studies in our grade 3 to 6s. We have picture storybooks. So we still do have that literature. I know our grade 2s or 3s are doing The Wind in the Willows. We've down the line with The Witch in the Wardrobe. But all the kids, the teacher reads to the students, and then they can follow along. So we are still, celebrating literature. We've got simultaneous story time coming up. We have book week. We've got library time. The teacher's reading to kids. So yeah, we definitely try and promote the love of reading. But we know that if kids can read, then they're probably going to enjoy it a lot more.
That is good to know. We have one specific question where it was a follow-up where they asked, how do you know that you're if you're moving away from guided reading, how do you know that you actually get to listen to kids read? How are you reassuring teachers that they still know their students are reading?
There's lots of reading happens in the classroom. Yeah. You go, Jacquie.
Yeah, look, our students are reading more than ever. So they're reading, from the screen. They're reading, their decodable books. They're reading in fluency pairs. There's just reading constantly happening. So I would say they're reading more than ever. And in terms of, the teachers moving away from guided reading, once our teachers sort of understood that, guided reading wasn't the most effective way of teaching, and we could give them some, things to do instead, or it wasn't really an issue. Yeah.
I did suspect that there was a lot of reading, and having seen it in action, I do know that's the case. And we've got another question where somebody's asked about the cost of implementing and changing an approach, and also what you might have done with some of the older resources like predictable texts and where they ended up going.
Not where I'd like them to go, to be honest. But look, we don't use them anymore. Couple of things on the cost. What we found was that, say, back in the day when we had leveled text, we'd have, 10 boxes of leveled text, and you'd need so many because kids weren't progressing. You don't need as many decodable readers because you don't need a whole set of 4 because you're not doing guided reading. So I think it's actually cheaper. We have chose really not to use any of the predictable text, except for the non-fiction ones, which, kids can use them if they're doing, interest, like looking at, out of interest at some things. But we don't use a lot. Yeah, we don't use the predictable text is the really short answer. And was there another part to that question, the cost?
I think you talked a little bit about the costs, but was there anything more about just thinking about overall how much it cost, or the things that were the biggest costs to invest in?
Look, the cost back when we started was definitely in building our teacher knowledge. And it would be lovely if the universities taught some of the things that our teachers needed to know about how kids learn to read. I think there's a lot more available information and professional learning around now, that there was a significant cost. And I guess it's just around, I don't necessarily think that, more money is the answer. It's how you spend your money. So we had a really narrow focus. So we did have to forgo some things because we wanted to focus on literacy and numeracy. Literacy at the start, and now it's moved into numeracy. So yeah, we made it a priority and we resourced it accordingly.
Yeah, makes sense. We've got another question, or it's kind of two questions I'm combining that are interested in student engagement in a way. So one of them is around just like thinking about student interest and voice and agency and how that's factored into this approach or how you think about it. And the other is more specific, thinking about those high ability learners and how you keep them engaged with tactics like the daily review.
Yeah. Okay, so student voice and agency, a question that we do get asked a lot. Again, we chose to prioritise our kids, being literate. So we think that if we give them, the best opportunity in that part, then in terms of they'll have more agency in their life. So for us, that's just a belief that our school held. We do let our students have some choice in some of the learning, but probably not in the really important areas. So in literacy. But like Halie said, we involve the kids in the why of, why we're doing daily reviews, or, we share data with the kids so they can see that and track their growth in certain areas. So we still do a lot of that stuff, but 5-year-olds don't know what the curriculum is and what they need to learn. So we don't really give that choice until they've got those foundational skills and knowledge. There's choice in, we do have an electives program at the school, so the students can choose passions, I guess, and things that they like to do. And yeah, that's probably about it. What was the second part of that question? Engagement of high ability kids?
Yeah, and particularly in structures like daily review.
Yeah, so we're always thinking about that, particularly now we've got, kids that are performing much higher than what they ever had before at Churchill Primary School. But there is differentiation you can do within those reviews and extension and things like that. So the teachers are often, once they're doing the checking for understanding, extending those kids with differentiation. So whether it be questioning or different tasks or did you want to add more to that, Halie?
Probably on some of the slides you didn't probably see, but we do have we have extensions. So there might be an extension task that, the kids that can do it, you will go to them and say, that's your task. Or we have above and below the line. So some of the kids who can just start it below the line, that they're the extended. And that's how we do that.
That is good to know. We have time for one more question. I suppose it's on the other end of the spectrum. Somebody's asking about how you cater for beginning English as an additional language students. I'm not sure at Churchill what the diversity is in your school, but how do you approach that if you're also taking a whole class approach?
You're on mute, Jacquie.
We don't have a high number of students who do have English as an additional language. But, with the whole class approach, we do have students that we put in scaffolds or differentiation to support them within that. And we have focused a lot and revisited differentiation within explicit direct instruction and how you actually do it. I guess the key takeaway for us is, I think sometimes people see differentiation as the kids having to do something different, whereas that's not always the case. It can be layered in with your teaching, but obviously there are times that kids might need to be working on goals in their IEPs, and that means they're doing something separate, or they might have a goal that's more important for them at that time. Did that answer that?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and particularly that rationale around differentiating in terms of the scaffold rather than the actual content as well. There's one question here where somebody asking they'd love to see some specific planners around teaching comprehension. I might lead them to reach out to you guys, Jacquie and Halie. But I do want to say an absolutely huge thank you. You've been so generous with your time tonight, but also much more broadly with sharing your approach. And I think getting to talk to schools who've actually put it into practice, seeing how all of the complexity comes together and built it up over years. I will say to those who are listening, this is the first of a series of 2 webinars with the case study schools that we've profiled in our report. Please come along to the next one at 7 p.m. on the 28th of June with Parafield Gardens High School. They'll be focusing specifically on their approach to catching up struggling readers, so their response to intervention model. At Grattan, all our work is freely available on the website, so if you want to look at our report, you can find it there. And if you want to read more, if you do, you can also donate there to support future Grattan reports. But I will wrap it up there and let you get back to your evening. Thank you so much for joining.